Thank you very much for that, Aisha. And yes, we indeed do have India's Principal Economic Advisor Sanjeev Sanyal joining us. The big GDP dangle or the big GDP duel, whatever you may call it. But in other countries, GDP perhaps is a factor of seasonality and investment cycles and global economy. In ours, it is a function of which was the government in power when the GDP was being measured and which is the one measuring it now. Sad it is, but Sanjeev Sanyal will throw some economic perspective into the GST. And thank you very much for joining us right here. If I may go headlong, and I know we are short on time here, I'm not going to wait and beat it on the bush. The average growth rate of 7.35% under the Modi government so far beats the average growth rate of 6.7% of UPA too. But the two big events under the Modi government so far have also been demonetization and GST. Is the suggestion that despite these momentous events, growth has been higher? Because people in the government, and yourself included, have said that these are events that may have reset the Indian economy. Are we saying that growth could have been higher despite a demonetization and a GST rollout?
Evidently, that's what the statistics say. I mean, the estimates that have just been announced are based on a internationally accepted framework. And by the way, the numbers of the last few years have not been changed. What has been changed is the back series. So I don't think anything about the current government has really changed with this. All that has changed is that the numbers before 2011-12 have now been, the growth rates are now available using a equivalent compatible framework. Now, as it happens to be, that same framework, when it was announced originally in 2015, provided a fillip to the growth rates of 2012-13 and 13-14. In fact, in the case of 12-13, the number was significantly increased in two shots. So it went up, if I remember correctly, from 4.7 to 5.1 to 5.5. So there was a very significant increase, not just once, but on two revisions. And when this new series was introduced, it dramatically increased the 13-14 number from 5% to 6.9%, and then because the base for the previous year had gone up, it was brought down to 6.4. But still, from the original estimate using the old series, right, it was significantly up. So the point is, you can't say that we'll accept it when it revises up, but not when it revises down.
There is a lot of politics to speak on that, and I will in just a bit. But let me first get the data out of the way, because you are somebody who specializes in that. Many say the new data doesn't pass the smell test, and which is why they are questioning it. One of the things that you understand better than a lot of other politicians do is you have to look at annual earning growth of about 500 of India's biggest companies. That averaged about 11% between 2006 and 2014, and that has nearly dropped to half in the last 4 years. What explains the disconnect? Can there be a case of growth which is being higher and lesser earnings?
Well, you have to remember, earnings is a nominal number. The numbers we are debating is a real GDP number. So if you go back and look at the nominal GDP growth rates of that period, because there was higher inflation, will be much, much higher. So I don't think these are compatible. You're comparing apples with apples. Once you have stripped out the fact that there was, prior to this government coming in place and the introduction of the MPC, structural inflation used to quite, typically range in the 8 to 10% range. In fact, there were some years in which it went well past into double digits. So you have to take into account that we have structurally lowered inflation, which means that all the nominal numbers, whether it's earnings, whether it's even nominal GDP growth rate, all of them came down.
Okay. Very quickly, before I move any further, if the economy is indeed doing better in the last 4 years, and this data comprehensively tells us that it is, this is no tweaking of the last 4-year data than the previous 5, would there have been the agrarian distress that one refers to? Would private investment be so lackluster, and wouldn't higher growth in the last 4 years as compared to the previous 5 have taken better care of the twin balance sheet problem? Because higher growth would have repaired balance sheets not just of companies but of banks as well. Why has that not happened?
I think you have touched on an important issue, and we should discuss it. I think the real issue of the period where the numbers have been revised downwards is not the revision downwards of the numbers at all. I mean, even if a GDP growth rate has been revised down from a little around 10% to 8.5% GDP growth rate for a particular year in real terms, that's still a very good growth rate. That was not the real problem. The real problem was that that growth was based on macro stability basis, which was simply untenable. So you had massive expansion in the fiscal deficit, massive expansion in credit, which incidentally began before the global financial crisis. So it can't just be said, oh, it was because of the financial crisis. And you saw inflation spiking up. So given that that was the context, much of what you see subsequently is the unwinding of that problem, which is that capacity is untenable, capacity is getting used up. Therefore, sure, the investment rate coming off a little bit. The huge cleanup of the banking system, which meant that bank credit slowed down. Again, you can't say that, you know, that is a bad thing because we had high bank credit growth before. Far from it. This is in fact, one was the problem and the other is the outcome of that problem.
Right. But
so when you are comparing like with like, you have to take a wider perspective. One is compare real GDP growth rate or real earnings with real numbers later on. Secondly, you have to take the wider context of what is happening to the macro stability numbers.
But no, fair point indeed. If I make, you know, you're right, you can't compare nominal earnings to say real GDP. But how do you explain the fact, and I have three specific questions on this. How do you explain the fact that private investment was at levels of 38% and GDP growth according to the new numbers wasn't even touching 8%? And if you look at the present day numbers, investment rate is sub 30% and Q1 GDP has crossed 8.2%. I mean, how do you explain the productivity argument in the two scenarios that I'm really referring to?
Say, obviously, one of them is a productivity argument because the same capacity which was being underutilized and in fact much of it had been misallocated is now getting used up. So you are getting growth, and incidentally the fact that there was an output gap created because of excessive build-up of capacities comes through from the fact that you had you know, growth without inflation as well. I mean, you can quibble about the specific number. The fact is growth was still strong, however you measure it. And the fact is it has been accompanied by a dramatic decline in inflation. So clearly capacity is needed to get used up, and as we speak those capacities are finally getting used up and you are beginning to see a return in investment. And by the way, through the entire process, infrastructure and other public investment continued apace. So that is not where things anyway slackened up.
No, I agree with you on the fact that perhaps capacity utilization is looking up and that's a glimmer of hope, and that's perhaps adding on to numbers here. But you and I both know that credit growth is a very good indicator of economic activity. There was a credit growth of nearly 25%, and which is very often referred to by the present government as reckless lending. Even if I go by that argument, 25% credit growth was giving a GDP growth of 7.7%. A credit growth of under 5% is giving us a number at 8.2% now.
So first of all, credit growth is now growing at the rate of 14%, as you may be aware.
Very recently.
As far as the 25% rate is concerned, well, one needs to go and look at why it is that 25% growth rate in credit was there in the first place. I mean, surely that is the question to be raised. And the fact that it was inefficient is for everybody to see. After all, we are paying the price in terms of the bank cleanup because of that credit expansion. So the fact that you had to have such, you know, enormous amount of credit expansion to get those kinds of growth rates is something that needs to be considered. That why is it that you needed so much credit growth to keep growth at a good rate? 7.7 is not to be sniffed at, and that is precisely the point I'm making. It is not about just the growth rate. In fact, the growth rate, even of 7.7%, 8.5%, whatever it is, maybe it's a little bit lower than what was estimated earlier. But the real issue is the efficiency of it and the macro stability problems it created. You were spiking up inflation, you saw fiscal deficits blowing up, the credit growth numbers that you just gave far from suggesting that that was something good, that is the source of the subsequent problem.
No, fair point. You know, if I were to just take that argument forward, if the previous government did badly on growth, which now numbers suggest we weren't growing as gloriously as one was made to believe then, how do you then justify the reckless lending or the untenable fiscal deficit? Because both of those things is a product of more economic activity. So are you telling me that the economic activity was low and even then fiscal deficit was untenable and there was more lending? I mean, one of these two arguments have to lose their sting, doesn't it?
No, first of all, I am not here to justify the period in which you had high fiscal deficit, high lending and so on. You should ask those who were in charge of the economy at that point in time to justify it. Why should I be the person asked to justify it?
Okay, you were not going to justify that period. I was just saying because you're criticizing that period, it's only fair that you also help me understand that one of the two arguments were losing. But you know, I will ask you a question, Sanjeev Sanyal, because as an economic advisor and somebody who understands what economic data does for investments...
I have to now leave, so this has to be the last question.
This will be the last question, but the way data, the way GDP growth data is now coming out and the way it's almost rewriting India's economic history, do you believe there is risk of muddying India's economic future in some sense? Because many people believe, what is the impact of this going to be on potential policy making going forward?
No. First of all, the CSO is a professional organization. For example, tomorrow we will get a GDP number. I have no idea what that GDP number may be. So let us not get into debating whether the CSO is somehow muddying the waters. It is following internationally accepted GDP estimation frameworks that, by the way, as I said, were accepted when they came up with upward revisions for certain years. Suddenly the same framework is now used backwards and provides somewhat different numbers, leads to suspicion. I think that is not fair. As far as the policy making is concerned, to be very frank, it doesn't really change very much. Okay, sure, the growth rates may be somewhat different, but if you look at the trajectory of that growth rate, it has not changed. It was at a certain level, then it dipped during the financial crisis period, then it went up subsequently. That general trend has not changed, nor has the problems we had with inflation, credit growth, fiscal deficit and current account, all of those have also not been changed. So I don't think the economic history has got rewritten in any particular way, even if the specific numbers have been changed a little bit.
Okay, on that note, we thank you very much for joining us. I know CSO is a professional organization. The debate isn't why is Niti Aayog involved with this, but I know it is not your place to justify that, just like it's not your place to justify what was happening in the UPA's time. But thank you very much, Sanjeev Sanyal, for being with us, India's principal economic advisor, in conversation with us on the GDP debate. Before I hand it over to both Aisha and Tanveer in the studios, it is a pity that we in India and Indian politicians are actually squabbling and discussing what happened in India's economic past, instead of putting their heads together and deciding our future. But that is the nature of politics, and GDP data is no unknown trajectory to that as well.